So I just want to bring you up to date and show you that the situation we're in the Ukraine with Russia was not only avoidable, but it was predicted by every expert who ever talked about it. And then, of course, Joe Biden and the United States just ignored all that. And it's as if the United States and NATO wanted a confrontation like this to happen in Ukraine. It's as if. So I'll show you. Here's what Aaron Mates tweeted out. He says, condemnations of Putin without acknowledging that the conflict started in 2014 are meaningless. United States backed the Maidan coup in 2014 and fueled the ensuing Donbass war, where 14,000 plus have died with the United States weapons. So I'm going to show you a video where Lindsey Graham and John McCain brag about, and Adam Schiff brag about arming those people in the Donbass to fight Russia. Russia's invasion is a new phase. It's illegal, but not out of the blue. And so this gentleman did a Twitter thread. He said, most fascinating thing about the Ukraine war is the sheer number of top strategic thinkers who warned for years that it was coming if we continued down the same path. No one listened to them, and here we are. Small compilation. So it goes from Kissinger to, here's the first guy. This first guy's name is Mearsheimer. Now, I never heard of this guy before, but this is a speech he gave in June 2015, and he's considered like the leading guy on foreign policy and international politics and stuff. And he gave this speech, so this is like, 7 years ago? And so listen to what he has to say, what got us to this point.
But I actually think that what's going on here is that the West is leading Ukraine down the primrose path. And the end result is that Ukraine is going to get wrecked. And I believe that the policy that I'm advocating, which is neutralizing Ukraine and then building it up economically and getting it out of the competition between Russia on one side and NATO on the other side, is the best thing that could happen to the Ukrainians. What we're doing is encouraging the Ukrainians to play tough with the Russians. We're encouraging the Ukrainians to think that they will ultimately become part of the West, because we will ultimately defeat Putin and we will ultimately get our way. Time is on our side. And of course, the Ukrainians are playing along with this. And the Ukrainians are almost completely unwilling to compromise with the Russians and instead want to pursue a hardline policy. As I said to you before, if they do that, the end result is that their country is going to be wrecked.
And it's happening.
What we're doing is, in effect, encouraging that outcome. I think it would make much more sense for us to work to create a neutral Ukraine. It would be in our interest to bury this crisis as quickly as possible. It certainly would be in Russia's interest to do so. And most importantly, it would be in Ukraine's interest to put an end to the crisis. Thank you. Interesting
that you never hear that guy on the MSNBCs or the CNNs or even the Fox Newses. I don't ever hear that guy anywhere. Do you ever hear that guy anywhere, Max?
Well, there's a reason, and it isn't necessarily related to Ukraine or Russia. It's that he co-authored a book along with another top international relations professor, Stephen Walt, called The Israel Lobby. I don't know if you remember that.
No, I don't remember that, but that's it. He's dead then.
It was a best-selling book. It was really the first book by two of the top IR scholars in the U.S. on the existence of an Israel lobby, and then they were painted as anti-Semites. Like the whole campaign that we saw against Jeremy Corbyn was sort of rolled out against them, and they had their reputations destroyed day after day by people like Atlantic editor and former Israeli prison guard Jeffrey Goldberg. So Mearsheimer's already been kind of marginalized, and that's maybe why you don't see him on MSNBC, although he is so much more distinguished and has far more credentials than the clowns you see on there, like Michael McFaul.
So there's one amazing expert who you would never think that. Even watching other YouTube shows, you would never think like, wait a minute, we intentionally pursued this path that was going to lead to this confrontation, knowing that the Ukraine people were going to pay the price, and we are hanging them out to dry. And we encourage this. So again, it's amazing to me that you're not going to hear this anywhere else except on the Grayzone or maybe Aaron's Twitter feed. I haven't heard anybody, I haven't seen it, anybody else covering this correctly in the United States Oh, I saw Glenn Greenwald did an okay. He did a good job. But are you? I have some more experts I'm going to show you that say basically the same thing, and because I just want to make the case, it's overwhelming. But I'm shocked. Actually, I know I can't believe I am. Maybe it's because I'm naive and stupid and gullible, and I thought that people learned a lesson from Iraq or Syria or Libya or Afghanistan, or they haven't. Are you as stunned as I am with the poor media coverage?
Not after Russiagate. This was all kind of, I got to say, this is kind of expected. I'm a little bit, well, we can talk about it. I'm a little bit shocked at how I think, even I would imagine even the, Russian security apparatus is a little bit shocked by how emotionally the West is reacting. And they're basing all their decisions on hysteria, including kicking Russian students out of universities, punishing Russian artists for refusing to publicly condemn Putin. There's the most famous hockey player here in Washington, Ovechkin. He's Russian. There's enormous pressure on him from the sports media to denounce Putin publicly. Texas and the Texas Restaurant Association has banned all Russian products. A friend of mine who teaches in New Jersey public school sent me bulletins where they're doing, talks for the students on how to support Ukraine in like public schools. I mean, it's gotten. And then we watched the State of the Union last night, where if you weren't wearing blue, you had to wear yellow or yellow and blue with the Ukrainian flag. AOC had a little like pendant on for Ukraine, and there was a clip in honor of Operation Paperclip, I guess, holding it to her shirt. But I mean, it's almost like we have to all be Ukraine firsters. And that's a little bit, that's a little bit over the top. I guess I didn't expect that, along with all the other, meaningful decisions, emptying the tank on sanctions, like removing Russia from the SWIFT system, targeting the Russian central bank. All of this will come back to bite the U.S. economy. And the fact is, most Americans care more about gas prices and inflation than they do about fighting for some oligarchic autocracy thousands of miles away.
Here's Noam Chomsky. Here's what he has to say. This was predicted. I think this is from 2015, maybe. Here we are.
The idea that Ukraine might join a Western military alliance would be quite unacceptable to any Russian leader. This goes back to 1990, when the Soviet Union collapsed. There was a question as to what would happen with NATO. Gorbachev agreed to allow Germany to be unified and to join NATO. It's a pretty remarkable concession, with a quid pro quo that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. That was the phrase that was used.
So Russia has been provoked.
Well, what happened? NATO instantly moved to East Germany. Then Clinton came along, expanded NATO right to the borders of Russia. Now there are the new Ukrainian government, the government after the overthrow of the preceding one. The parliament voted, I think 300 to 8 or something like that, to move to join NATO.
Which you can understand why they would want to join NATO. You can see why Petro Poroshenko's government would probably see that it's protecting his country.
No, it's not protect. Crimea was taken away after the overthrow of the government, right? And he's not protecting Ukraine, is threatening Ukraine with major war. That's not protection. The point is, this is a serious strategic threat to Russia, which any Russian leader would have to react to. That's well understood.
So that's predictable, exactly, happening exactly what he said. And now here's Stephen Cohen, who's recently passed, was leading scholar on Russia. I think we had him on our show a few times. So here he is.
If we move the forces, NATO forces, including American troops, toward Russia's borders, where will we be then? I mean, it's obviously going to militarize the situation and therefore raise the danger of war. And I think it's important to emphasize, though I regret saying this, Russia will not back off. This is existential. Too much has happened. Putin, and it's not just Putin. We seem to think Putin runs the whole of the universe. He has a political class. That political class has opinions. Public support is running overwhelmingly in favor of Russian policy. Putin will compromise at these negotiations, but he will not back off if confronted militarily. He will.
So these are the smarty pantsies guys in the world that know about this situation the most, and they all predicted this is going to happen if the United States keeps pursuing this policy, and of course we did, and so did the Ukraine government, which had no interest in negotiating, and I wonder why. Because the West didn't want them to, because they wanted to force this. Here's another expert. Most recently, right before the war broke out, this is famous economist Jeffrey Sachs. We've shown Jeffrey Sachs on this show many times, and he told the truth about Syria on MSNBC, and the whole network almost melted down. So Jeffrey Sachs is writing a column in the FT, what is that? Foreign, whatever.
Financial Times.
Financial Times, warning that NATO enlargement is utterly misguided and risky. True friends of Ukraine and global peace should be calling for the United States and NATO compromise with Russia. So there's Jeffrey Sachs. Here's someone else. Here's CIA Director Bill Burns. In 2008, he said Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for Russia, and I have yet to find anyone who views Ukraine in NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russian interests. Here's another expert, Malcolm Fraser, 22nd Prime Minister of Australia, warned in 2014 that the move east by NATO is provocative, unwise, and a very clear signal to Russia. He adds that this leads to a difficult and extraordinarily dangerous problem. So we created this problem. Former U.S. Defense Secretary Bob Gates, in his 2015 memoir, said moving so quickly to expand NATO was a mistake. Trying to bring Georgia and Ukraine into NATO was truly overreaching and an especially monumental provocation. So we've been provoking this, and every expert who's looked at it or commented on it has said so. Except you never see any of this in the news right now. And so people are running around like morons, pledging their unity with the people of Ukraine, and they don't realize they're propping up a Nazi organization that just imprisoned all the opposition newspapers and their opposition political leader. Did you know that they did that? Yeah. So here's another one. Paul Keating, a former Australian Prime Minister in 1997, said expanding NATO is an error, which may rank in the end with the strategic miscalculations which prevented Germany from taking its full place in the international system in the early 20th century. Here's Sir Roderick Lynn, former British ambassador to Russia. He warned a year ago that pushing Ukraine into NATO is stupid on every level. He adds, if you want to start a war with Russia, that's the best way of doing it. So here's another one. This is from Pat Buchanan. In his 1999 book, A Republic, Not an Empire, he said, by moving NATO onto Russia's front porch, we have scheduled a 21st century confrontation. And here it is. So I'll stop there for a moment and bring Max back in, and it's I still can't get over my jaws agape at just the journalistic malfeasance that's being perpetrated on the people of the United States right now. The propaganda that they're being bombarded with at every turn is overwhelming. I mean, I don't know how a normal person, like if I didn't study this, if I was just a regular comedian, I probably wouldn't know any of that. I would think the same thing. But it just keeps happening. We keep inventing a new boogeyman. There's never not a boogeyman for the United States. And why did we want to get Ukraine into NATO? Many reasons. A big one is so that we could sell them weapons, because once you get into NATO, you have a certain amount of military hardware you have to maintain. And so that's why we expanded to all those countries. NATO is not a defensive organization anymore. Anyway, let me throw it over to Max.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't think Ukraine is a Nazi organization, or that its population are majority Nazi-like people, or that they even approve of the Nazis in their midst. But even if a president like Vladimir Zelensky wanted to, and he did run on a kind of peace ticket with no shortage of support from the Russian-speaking population, even if he had wanted to follow the Minsk Accords or the Steinmeier formula cooked up by the German foreign minister to de-escalate along the border with the breakaway republics in the Donbass, the U.S. was right behind him, pushing for conflict, sending in billions of dollars of weapons, sending in thousands of U.S. troops, U.S. trainers who have actually worked with the neo-Nazi militias and worked with the most extreme elements on the ground. You have people in the Biden administration like Michael Carpenter, who shepherded around the founder of two fascist parties in Ukraine, Andrei Parubi, to Washington on a lobbying trip. The U.S. has been pushing Ukraine into conflict. The U.S. was behind the 2013-14 Maidan coup, which brought in this government in order to push it into NATO and to drive conflict with Russia. And what Americans don't understand, and what they're not told, is what it means for a country on Russia's border to belong to NATO, which is a permanent war alliance, which has no reason to exist in its current incarnation after the Cold War, except to encircle, threaten, and contain Russia and push for conflict. And now it's moving towards conflict with China. It's getting active, in the South China Sea. It's getting active even in Colombia on the Venezuelan border. That's how much NATO is expanding with its partner states. What does that mean? It means you have dual use missile systems on your border if you're Russia, pointed at you. You have armies that are trained to fight your soldiers on your borders. So there's actually a really good speech on YouTube by another academic, a Russian academic who's actually kind of a liberal, Vladimir Posner, who poses a scenario before an American audience, something that no one could do on US cable news, that is so instructive and important. It's a thought exercise that everyone should be doing right now. What if Russia had an alliance with other powerful countries, let's say China and India maybe, and they put troops on the US border and began training Mexico's military to fight the US, and put dual-use missile systems that could reach US cities on the US-Mexico border? What would the United States do? And what would Americans ask their leadership and their military to do if they were threatened in that way? Now, what if those troops happen to also be ideologically, some of them, let's say a substantial percentage, 20%, happen to be ideologically neo-Nazi and wanted to murder and commit genocide against a part of the American population? I don't know if neo-Nazi is the right thing, but ideologically, let's say they were ideologically anti-black and wanted to murder black people, because that's a really good analog for the neo-Nazi forces in the so-called Grayzone in Ukraine, on the front lines in Donbass, who really do want to murder Russian speakers and have done so, who have committed pogroms against Russian speakers, as well as Roma people and minorities and gay people and so on. So that's the scenario that we should think about. What would the U.S. do? What did the U.S. do during the Cuban Missile Crisis? The Pentagon Joint Chiefs were calling for a nuclear attack on Cuba. And it was only thanks to the Kennedy brothers that didn't happen for the most part, and détente with Khrushchev. So that's what Russia's facing when we put NATO, or try to put NATO in Ukraine. And yes, Ukraine is not officially a part of NATO. I don't think NATO would actually want them, because it's such a corrupt and impoverished country, especially under this post-coup regime. But it's been effectively NATOized by all of these US weapon systems, US troops coming in there. And Russia has finally acted. And just one quick other point, something Aaron Mate raised in his tweet about something that you will not hear in US media, is that the Donbass has been the site of some 14,000 dead, many thousands more wounded most of those dead have been on the Russian-speaking side, the so-called pro-Russian separatist side. And these are just average people who've been caught in a conflict, who've been shelled by the Ukrainian military and neo-Nazi paramilitaries year after year after year, as the Ukrainian government, most recently Zelensky, the hero of US media, violates every part of the peace process and keeps the war going. So this is just continuing endlessly. And with, there's no reason to come on here and endorse the Russian military incursion. But this is the context for understanding it. And the context that the US media consumer is getting, if you want to be a sheep and watch MSNBC all the time and watch people like Michael McFaul, who actually helped conceive this disastrous policy of containment, you're going to hear that Vladimir Putin has brain cancer and long COVID and is sitting at 40-foot long tables from his advisors because he's gone completely mad and is this isolated Dr. Skeletor villain in his Kremlin psycho castle in a padded room alone, seeking to restore the Soviet Union. The whole conflict has been boiled down to and reduced to one figure who is being painted as insane in order to paper over all of the real issues and the direct responsibility of NATO in fueling this conflict. It is NATO expansion that is the root of all evil here, and that's what Americans need to understand.
So here, I just want to show people because nobody in the United States can find Ukraine on a map. So here it is. And so this is the part. So after the 2014 Maidan coup, these people didn't want to go along with the coup to just overthrow their democratically elected government. So they were fighting to not go along with it. And so the government of Ukraine and their Azov battalion, which is a neo-Nazi battalion, has been shelling and killing 14,000 of these people in the last 8 years. But there was an agreement for them to stop in 2014 called the Minsk Agreements, and there was supposed to be a ceasefire. They're supposed to withdraw their military from that area, and they were supposed to hold elections and let those people who live in this area have more autonomy. They didn't do any of that. They just keep killing them. And so that's why the spokesperson for Russia government said the other day that his actions are to end a war. He's not starting a war. That's what the Russian, and that makes a lot of sense. Now, again, I want to go back and say, when I said that people are being duped into solidarity with the Ukraine people, which is a good thing. Nobody wants to see people be a victim of a war. But unwittingly, people are propping up a government that's unbelievably corrupt and in bed with neo-Nazis. So that's what I mean. I mean the people of Ukraine are neo-Nazi. I mean that their government is unbelievably corrupt and was the result of an overthrow of a democratically elected government. We helped do that, the United States. And then we kept funding their shelling and killing of these people here. We kept funding it. You want to see how I know this? Because, well, here's Adam Schiff admitting it.
The United States aids Ukraine and her people so that we can fight Russia over there and we don't have to fight Russia here.
Yeah, so it wasn't like Putin woke up one morning and decided to invade Ukraine. This has been we've been warned against doing this for decades, and we kept doing it. And here's Lindsey Graham and John McCain going over there in this area that I just pointed out to you, talking to those people who were killing Ukrainians. And here's what they said.
I admire the fact that you will fight for your homeland. Your fight is our fight.
And Klobuchar.
Yeah.
2017 will be the year of offense. All of us will go back to Washington and we will push the case against Russia.
2017 will be the year of offense for them against Russia. That's what he's saying. And we're going to go back to Washington. We're going to try and help you in this war. There's supposed to be a ceasefire agreement. The United States endorsed it. So did France. So did Russia. So did Germany. They're not abiding by it. And who's there? These two warmongering maniacs that keep funding them and keep funding that war and the slaughter of those people.
Enough of a Russian aggression. It is time for them to pay a heavier price.
It is time for Russia to pay a heavier price. Do you know who's going to pay the heavy price? The people of Ukraine are paying the heavy price. That's who's paying. The people in the Donbass area have been paying a heavy price for the last 8 years. And now all of Ukraine is going to be paying a price for this kind of warmongering craziness.
Yeah. Lindsey Graham's not paying a price. He's actually getting campaign contributions from the Lockheed Martin and Raytheon death dealers that are making a fortune off of Ukraine being an imperial outpost for the U.S. So it's those guys in that picture. Those are our bullet stoppers in the U.S. We don't care about them. We want to fight this war to the last Ukrainian.
I want to show you one more expert before we wrap up this segment. Here's one more expert that predicted this. And Joe Biden and NATO did it anyway. I was there, NATO and the origins of the Ukraine crisis. After the fall of the Soviet Union, I told the Senate that expansion would lead us to where we are today. And who wrote this? Is written in February 15th, 2022. That's this year. Jack F. Matlock Jr., and here's what he said. He said, Putin's demand is that the process of adding new members to NATO cease and that Russia has assurance that Ukraine and Georgia will never be members. President Biden has refused to give such assurances, but made clear his willingness to continue discussing questions of strategic stability in Europe. So this guy who was there at the time, predicts. So that's just another. So I could just show you endless amount of experts who predicted that this would happen. This never gets talked about. Here it is in Salon. NATO leaves little room for diplomacy. How the war machine upped the ante in Ukraine. And this is a quote from George Kennan. He's arguably America's greatest ever foreign policy strategist, the architect of the U.S. Cold War strategy. And here's what he said. He said, don't people understand? Our differences in the Cold War were with the Soviet communist regime. And now we are turning our backs on the very people who mounted the greatest bloodless revolution in history to remove that Soviet regime. And Russia's democracy is as far advanced, if not farther, as any of these countries we've just signed up to defend from Russia. Of course, there is going to be bad reaction from Russia, and then the NATO expanders will say that we always told you that is how the Russians are. But this is just wrong.
George Kennan is, that's the most significant quote right there, Jimmy. It was George Kennan who, as the American ambassador in Moscow, or the charge d'affaires, wrote the famous long telegram, an 8,000-word telegram to the Secretary of State, outlining his view of the Soviet Union and how to contain it. He conceived the doctrine of containment that became the basis for the Cold War. So the guy who was the intellectual architect of the Cold War, and to a large extent, the U.S. national security state apparatus, was telling the truth about NATO towards the end of his life, that NATO would lead to a revival, a new Cold War, and new conflict like the one we're witnessing now, if NATO continued to expand in explicit violation of the agreements made between Gorbachev and George H.W. Bush. And that's exactly what happened. So there could be no more significant figure than Kennan to issue that warning. And it's been totally ignored by the leadership today, who are just completely reckless and careening towards World War III.
And here's the part that everybody's ignoring, is that we instituted that coup. We did it. The United States. Victoria Nuland was caught on a recording. She was the Undersecretary of State. She's now again back there doing that same job and messing with Ukraine. And
former Chief of Staff to Dick Cheney.
There you go. No, I didn't know that. She was Dick Cheney's Chief of Staff?
Yeah, she worked for Dick Cheney. Her husband is Robert Kagan, who was a advisor to George W. Bush and helped conceive the Project for a New American Century with Bill Kristol, which was the conglomeration of neocons who were calling for the U.S. to dominate the world as a benevolent dictator of the world and to invade Iraq and destroy Iran and everything that we're witnessing today. I mean, this is a hardcore neocon who is the leading official in the State Department presiding over policy in Ukraine and Russia, who was also the key architect of the Maidan coup from the U.S. side. It's scary.
It is scary, the people that are in charge right now. It's scary, the propaganda that's being spewed by the American media, and the American public just eats it up. It's so, I mean, I could do this.
Liberals eat it up. It's liberals who opposed George W. Bush and the Iraq war who are eating it up the most. I mean, they are the most warlike.
Here's what Henry Kissinger said about it. Even Henry Kissinger got this right. Henry Kissinger, to settle Ukraine crisis, start at the end. He says if Ukraine is to survive and thrive, it must not be either side's outpost against the other. It should function as a bridge between them. Meaning it shouldn't be in bed with the West, it shouldn't be in bed with Russia. It should serve as a bridge between them. The European Union must recognize that its bureaucratic dilatoriness and subordination of the strategic element to domestic politics in negotiating Ukraine's relationship to Europe contributed to turning a negotiation into a crisis. A wise U.S. policy towards Ukraine would seek a way for the two parts of the country to cooperate with each other. We should seek reconciliation, not the domination of a faction. So when you saw John McCain and Lindsey Graham and Amy Klobuchar saying we're going to give you, and Adam Schiff, that's the exact opposite of what a guy like Kissinger said to do. Even Kissinger knows that's a bad idea. So this is where they're sending the arms here. This is what it's all started, all this. So they're supposed to not be doing that. There's supposed to be a ceasefire. The United States didn't want a ceasefire. The United States kept flooding arms there and arming Nazis. And I showed you even Canada did that. So let's see. And by the way, so just so you know, 1 in 6 Ukrainians is an actual ethnic Russian. And 1 in 3 Ukrainians' first language is Russian. So that's a third of the country. And most of those people live right here. And so after 8 years of the Ukraine government with the funding and arms provided by the West, the United States, after 8 years of them not abiding by the Minsk agreement and not stopping shelling these people, they fight. By the way, you know how it all started off? There was a Nazi regime that burned a bunch of people alive at a union hall.
Well, there was a Nazi mob.
Right. There was a Nazi mob.
Yes. So they had set up a little protest tent. They were Russian, native Russian speakers in Odessa, which has a large population of native Russian speakers. And after the coup in 2014, when they were completely disenfranchised, they set up a protest tent in front of that union hall. That Nazi mob was dispatched by, like, almost officially, to attack them. They ran in the union hall. The hall was set on fire and they were burned alive.
And then when people tried to jump out the windows to get away from the fire, they beat the shit out of them.
Correct. And one of the people who was responsible for it, his name is Sergei Sternenko. He was involved as a branch of the fascist group Right Sector that killed all these people in Odessa. He was on Fox News like a week and a half ago to rally Americans in support of Ukraine. Wow. He is a fascist organizer who actually Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky sought to appoint as the head of Ukraine's security service. I mean, it didn't go through, but this is someone who's, getting on US media and is a straight up mass murderer.
Hey, we've got more dates for our 2022 stand-up tour. We're going everywhere. We're going to Dallas, Houston, Florida. We're going to Omaha, Des Moines, Pittsburgh, Columbus, Ohio, and Los Angeles. Go to jimmydorecomedy.com for a link for all the tickets for all our shows.